In this week's TYRANIS tip, we're going to talk about the basics of soldering. First things first, you're going to need a soldering iron. This one's mine, and I will admit I could really use a new tip on this thing, but we're going to hammer through today anyways. Next thing you're going to want is something to clean your tip. Again, it's not going to make a huge difference for me because mine's in a pretty sad state, but good to have. I also like to have my little set of helping hands here. This is going to help me hold my wires together and in place while I'm soldering them. And then finally, a nice pair of wire strippers. These are automatic wire strippers, which are really cool, and I'll show you how those work. Can't get the Radio Shack ones anymore, but I'll find a link to some other ones. First, let's just talk about soldering one wire to another. The first thing we're going to want to do is take our wire and feed it into our strippers, and let's strip off a decent amount of that end piece. And so you can see we got that right here. I'll set that down. Let's do the other one about the same. So before we start soldering anything together, we're going to want to make a really good mechanical connection between these two wires. And the first thing I'm going to do is we're going to take the ends and just sort of twist them here in our fingers to get all those strands wrapped together nicely. It's very important. You don't want any loose strands hanging out the side of your connections. You want to keep this all nice and tight. It's also very important that your hands are super clean when doing this. Any of the oils from your skin or grease from the stuff you may have otherwise been working on, that gets in here, it's going to cause the solder to not want to stick, and you're going to have a bad time. So I just washed my hands thoroughly. And now the first connection we're going to talk about is what I call a pigtail connection. And basically it's very simple. You just do basically what we just did on each of these ends, but we're going to put the two together. Twist them together like this. And now we've got ourselves a very simple connection. And now we're going to come in with our soldering iron, make sure our tip is clean. And what I'm going to do here is just apply a little bit of solder to the tip, and this is going to help us transfer the heat from the soldering iron into our connection much better. You're going to want to have good ventilation when doing this. You'll see that there's a lot of smoke that comes off as the solder melts. You don't want to breathe that in. Make sure you either have a fan or a fume catcher, something to get rid of all those fumes so you don't inhale them. I'm going to go ahead and take my soldering iron and apply it to the underside of my connection here. A mistake a lot of people make is to just load up the tip of their soldering iron and try and paint the solder onto the connection. You don't want to do that. What you want to do is get your connection hot enough so that when you touch it with your solder all the way across, the solder is going to just melt and wick itself into your connection. Like so. So I'm not actually touching the soldering iron here, but I've heated up my connection well enough that it's just melting my solder and pulling it right in. And there we go. That's a pigtail connection. This is one that I don't use that frequently unless I really have to, just because it'll pull apart a little bit easier than the next connection, which I'm going to show you, which is an inline connection. Now, if you want to take this and apply some heat shrink to it, all you have to do is bend this guy down and flat, like that. And we'll take our heat shrink tubing. I'm able to slide it over the ends, but you want to make sure that you've already got it on one of the ends of your connection before doing this, otherwise you can't get it on there. So let's go ahead and slide this on. And then either with a heat gun or just a lighter, we'll come in here and heat up that heat shrink, and that's going to close in our connection really nice. I do this with all the connections on our carts, and it's so cheap and easy to do, you'll never want to mess with electrical tape ever again. So there's your pigtail. Up next, we're going to do the same thing. strip the ends of our wires. Gather all of your strands on one side and on the other. This is going to be an inline splice. This is a little bit trickier to do, but it's a much stronger connection. I cross my wires up right about here, and then I'll hold them steady and wrap one end around the other, like so, and then go the other way with the other one. And now you'll see I can go ahead and pull this all together. And it's not perfect because I'm trying to do this away from myself to show y'all, but this is essentially what you're going to end up with, and this is going to hold together much better than your pigtail. And I also like it because it ends up nice and flush with your wire, and you don't get any lumps in your heat shrink like you do here, where you can see that place that it's bent over. Alright, that looks much better. I redid it because I didn't like how the first one came out. Again, I'm reaching around trying to do this. It's a little tricky. So now let's go ahead and get this soldered. Same thing, clean off your tip. Tin the tip of our soldering iron. And let's just heat up our connection. Just working our way across, moving the heat as I go. And there is our inline splice. Again, this is my preference for when splicing two wires together. This is always how I like to do it, unless I have to move to the pigtail for whatever reason. If you're smart, you would have already had your heat shrink tubing on there. We'll wait for this to cool down just a little bit and slide our heat shrink over. Grab our lighter. And that's real nice and strong. And now the final thing I'll show y'all is how I like to put our connectors on our cables. So I frequently use these little crimp style connections. I just go ahead and I pull the crimp piece off. I'm sure you can buy them like this, but I just have so many of the other kind laying around, it's not a big deal to pull them apart. And so again, we're going to want to make a good mechanical connection before we start soldering. So you can see here, we're only going to need about 1/4 of an inch of wire stripped in order to get it into this connection here. So that's what we're going to do. Just a little bit. Same thing. Twist it up. And then what I like to do is I'll take this, drop it right on here, and then use a pair of needle nose to crimp it down. You can see I just did one side. It's holding on. We'll do the other side. Squeeze that down pretty good. Again, this is not what they're designed to be used for, but a lot of people have these crimp style connectors, and if you want to solder them, this is the best way I've found to do it. Let's drop this guy back in our helping hands. And now for this one, again, just like we're used to, we're going to come up from underneath and try and apply our heat on there real nice. And now this time, I'm going to be aiming for sort of right here, where you can see the ends of the wire coming through the connector. Get a little bit of solder on there. And if you've got this hot enough, that solder is going to want to wick into the connector to where all your wires are. And then I usually like to just run a little bit here so this doesn't open up on me, and then I put a little bit at the end to really lock it up. Once you're good, take your heat off, let that hang out for a second. And once it's cool to the touch, I'll go ahead and slide my heat shrink on, and I pull mine right to the edge of my connector on the female end. Heat this up, flip it over, get the other side. Looks pretty good. Now let's do the male one. Same thing. Here's our little connector. This is going to get inserted into the female. So we can just pull this apart. Same thing here. We only need about 1/4 inch. On the female connectors, you don't really have to worry about sliding your heat shrink on first. But with these male connections, because I don't actually need my heat shrink to make it all the way down this blade, just to about here, I use usually a slightly smaller piece, and I do like to slide that onto my wire first. So, gather our ends. Here's the heat shrink I'm going to use. Slide that onto our wire. And now, just like before, I'm just going to set this little guy right on there. And I'll use my needle nose pliers to carefully crimp it down. One side, and then the other side. Come up with our heat from the bottom. And you want as much surface area touching your connection for optimal heat transfer. Dab our solder in and around. Get it on that connection. That's probably a little bit overkill, but hey, it's gonna work. Let this one cool down. And once it has, we'll slide our heat shrink up to about right here. A little hot, but I'm getting antsy. And there you have it. A nice, clean, soldered, removable connection. And if you're really worried about this tiny little gap here, you can always put a bigger piece of heat shrink over top or hit it with a little bit of electrical tape. It's up to you. If you found this video helpful, hit that thumbs up button and subscribe if you haven't already. If you've got any questions or ideas for future TYRANIS tips, leave those down in the comments, and we'll see you in the next one.